Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me. I need to explain my background there. I live in West Virginia, but that is not West Virginia. I chose an appropriate background for my presentation. That is actually, are you hearing me okay, Sandy? Just nod. Yeah, okay.
Yes, yes.
This is actually Mount Mulanje in southern Malawi, which is pretty interesting because it forms the border with Mozambique. Now, I'd love to tell you that I climbed this thing when I was doing a workshop down there, but in fact I sat in a hotel amongst the tea plantations, sipping a beer and just admiring the mountain from a distance. But it's an example of a physical feature that actually does form a border. I'm going to be arguing tonight that a lot of the borders that are on the map today really don't make a whole lot of sense at all there for various reasons, artificial. But anyway, let me just sort of go back a little bit. I've been fascinated with borders really ever since childhood. I was brought up in Britain, and my parents took my sister and myself on camping vacations to France and Spain and Italy. And for me, the exciting part of them was not the beach, it was crossing the border, the border guards, the barriers and all of that, this sort of little frisson of excitement. Are we going to get through? Is there going to be a problem with our passports? So I was always really interested about borders, even from childhood. But then when I got a little older, I went on to a career in journalism and later academe. I started thinking about borders, shall we say, a little more analytically. Are they simply political or geographical, marked by posts and walls and fences, or do we need to think of them more broadly? Some borders take no account of geography, language, or culture. There's also borders within countries, physical, economic, and social. And just the title of this presentation, The Borders of Our Minds, I like to think about the way in which we perceive borders within the world. And I want to invite you at the end to share your own experiences, tragic, funny, just interesting, crossing borders, because there's a lot that we can learn from each other about it. So this presentation is based loosely on the final chapter of Postcards from the Borderland. I've done a lot of travel in the last 25 years. Kind of started off in that place where Harvey Fladd and I met in Kyrgyzstan, but since then I've been to a lot of places, most recently kind of around the Indian Ocean region. Before COVID shut me down, I was working in Bangladesh. And I'm kind of what I call an accidental tourist or an accidental travel writer. I mean, I don't go to places to write about them. Someone hires me to go and do a project, to teach, do some training, do some research, some consulting. And while I'm there, I write and I send email essays back to a lot of friends and colleagues. I've got about 700 people on my list. And then after a few years, I find I've got a book out of it. And so my first book was based on those experiences in Central Asia, which we'll get to a little later in the presentation, Postcards from Stanland. And I was going to Central Asia up to about 2012. The second book, Monsoon Postcards, focuses on Madagascar, India, Bangladesh and Indonesia, all places I've been to more recently. And Postcards from the Borderlands sort of pulls from a lot of places to kind of look at how we deal with borders. Some borders just don't look like borders at all. So here I am on the border between Europe and Asia. I mean, would you guess it? This is the southern Urals in Russia. And the only thing telling you it's a border is this a little marker on the side of the road. And of course you go and do the standard photo here, 1 foot in Europe, 1 foot in Asia. But I mean, it kind of shows how kind of strange borders are. The Urals are not very high mountains mountains at all. I mean, the border is kind of along the watershed, but where the road goes here, it's down in a valley, and, you know, it's just like trees, you know. This tree's in Europe and this tree's in Asia. Come on, you know, it's pretty artificial. So, you know, things like this sort of get me thinking about how we define, how we think about borders, those lines on the maps. So we're going to start off a little closer to home, and this is Daniel Wallingford's classic 1932 map. I love to do this to even an upstate New York audience. The New Yorker's view of the United States. He sold this by mail order. And I mean, it's funny, you know, we can laugh at it here, but I mean, there's quite a lot of research that shows that we tend to perceive the places where we live, our own communities, our own states, our regions, as larger and more important than they actually are in terms of physical size or extent. So, Brooklyn is larger than most states of the Union as far as I can tell. The lower New York harbor covers most of the Carolinas there, and of course, you know, southern New York is Florida there. And then as you sort of move out west, everything gets sort of really jumbled up. I mean, it's quite interesting to have people from different states sort of look at it. Well, you know, where is Indiana? Oh, you know, but I mean, I think it speaks quite a lot to the way in which people do perceive places. And, you know, there's a lot of these kind of maps around which are quite funny. Wallingford actually moved to Boston after he was in New York, and then he did a Bostonian's view of the United States, which puts New York City at least at its proper place geographically. And then, you know, there are these things like this. I mean, it's from the New Yorker cover 1976, where it's very clear, say, civilization ends at the Hudson River. I mean, the rest of the United States is kind of this sort of compressed lump beyond there. And then as for other countries, whoa, way in the distance. But as I just said, you know, there's a lot of pretty good research to show that people make these mental maps. They construct mental maps which have their own borders and their own perceptions of the size of places, which as I say, really don't correspond very well to geographical reality. So I'm going to switch to something else here, and this actually is a part of a Soviet era high school historical map of the United States. It's just showing the northeastern United States. I couldn't get the whole map onto my slide here. And I bought this at a bookstore in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, in 1996. And at the airport, there was the usual hassle with the customs officials. They claimed this was an important cultural artifact, and I was certainly prohibited from exporting it. But if I insisted on exporting it, they had to charge me their special export fee, you know, the usual thing there. So we argued for a bit. My Russian wasn't great at that time, but I could certainly argue enough in Russian. And I pointed out that maps like this had hung on schoolroom walls throughout the Soviet Union for many decades. It was neither rare nor was it valuable. And so they confiscated some knick-knack from my suitcase and sent me on my way. I didn't know much Russian at the time, but when my Russian improved, I started to study this map in a little bit more detail. It focuses on economy and population for the period from the end of the 19th to the early 20th century. It's got symbols on the legend on the right. Ugol, the square, is coal. Neft is oil. Железные руды, the triangle at the bottom, iron ore deposits. So it's really on population, mineral deposits and things like that. But the thing that fascinated me about the map were all of these red flags that were all over it, the most prominent symbols on the map. I mean, what did they mean? And I couldn't quite read, or I couldn't quite understand the thing in the legend, but I looked at the dates, and the historian in me started clicking there and saying, aha, okay, these were scenes of industrial unrest in the United States. So the great railroad strikes in Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, 1877, 1886, the Homestead Strike in Pittsburgh, and so on. And actually the legend is for Рабочее движение, which literally means workers' movements. So to me this was absolutely fascinating, the history of the United States taught to Soviet school children through the ideological lens of strikes and labor unrest. And the red flags are the most prominent symbols on the map, you know, more prominent than population and other things as well. And so, I mean, you know, the borders on this map, I mean, the state borders are represented, but the real borders on this map are class borders. They're borders between, you know, the proletariat, the working masses, and those capitalist bosses supported by the government who are trying to oppress them. So I find it to be, I mean, this hangs in my house, and every time I go up and down, as I look at it, and I glean a little bit more. It's just a fascinating historical document. So this perception of the United States divided by class warfare, strikes, racial oppression, that survived the fall of the Soviet Union. And so this is one of my favorite maps. It's the English language version of how the United States is going to fall apart. Now, this may be a surprise to you, but I think we need to put this in historical perspective here. You know, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was a great shock for a lot of people, including Vladimir Putin, apparently, who's trying to put it back together right now. But it would be very satisfying when, you know, the great country or the great empire of which you were a part fell apart. It'd be very satisfying to know that your arch enemy was also going to disintegrate. So this is the work of a guy called Igor Panarin, who was a policy wonk and an academic at the Kremlin, and he predicted that just as the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, so the USA would collapse. Mass immigration, economic decline, moral degradation, there'd be a civil war, collapse of the dollar, and various parts of the United States would join various other countries. And so let's see, New York, you're going to become part of the European Union, which I suppose is pretty good news actually, because my former country, Britain, left it. Okay, need to make up the numbers there. Now, this all looks very silly, but when I was traveling in Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan in 2003, 2004, people would come up to me and they would say, oh, we hear the United States is going to fall apart. I said, that's silly. Where did you get that? They said, oh, it has been shown, and then sort of refer me to the Russian version of this thesis. Now, Panarin, as an academic, put a caution in there that, in fact, the risk of disintegration was only sort of 45 to 55%, but people overlooked that qualification there, and this was a very widely circulated map, and of course, it didn't happen. But I think, put it in historical context, quite satisfying to know that Russia, we're going to get back Alaska. That's very good. Okay, that what happened to the great Soviet Union is also going to happen to the United States. So I know this looks silly. What I take out of this is that we all kind of construct these mental maps, whether we're, Soviet academics or Soviet citizens or New Yorkers or whoever, and they're shaped by who we are, our age, gender, etc. But when I look at the map, maps, some borders don't seem to make any more sense than these mental borders. When I was an undergraduate, sometime in the 19th century, I think that was, I studied European history from the 16th century through the French Revolution, early 19th century. Lots of wars going on there, lots of territory changing hands, who had Alsace-Lorraine this week, So the borders seem to keep changing a lot within Europe. But when I opened the atlas and I started looking at other parts of the world, I started asking other questions. Why are some countries very strangely shaped with portions of territory protruding into other countries? And what about those straight line borders, particularly in the Middle East and Africa? So the answer here, and we're just going to kind of use the Africa example, is that these are the product of colonialism. So in the so-called scramble for Africa through much of the 19th century, the colonial powers carved up this continent between them based on their own interests, geopolitical and economic. And after they'd done that at the Berlin Conference, there were boundary commissions established to define particular borders. Without any regard to topography, geography, ethnicity, culture, or anything like that. And I love this. This is actually a pretty well used quote from the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. And I'm sorry, I can't do his upper class accent, or I would. But, he's in London, he's not in Africa, he's in London with his French counterparts, and they're trying to decide on the border between the British colony of Nigeria and the French colony of Niger. And he said, we're drawing lines upon map where no white man's foot ever trod. Well, that's true. Giving away mountains and rivers, only hindered by the small impediments that we never knew exactly where they were. Completely arbitrary divisions, and which have created since then huge issues within the African continent, not just in Africa, but it's probably the best example there. So there's two principles here. I mean, this is this little academic part of it here, which we sort of need to think about here, of how you draw borders. One is, I'm going to murder the Latin, uti possidetis iuris, as you possess under the law. And that's the principle that, when a country becomes independent, when a colony becomes independent, you simply use its old borders, to become a new sovereign state. This kind of originated in South America in the 19th century when the Spanish Empire was coming apart, and and they decided, well, this one's going to be Argentina, this one's going to be Chile, this is going to be Peru, etc. etc. They used the old colonial borders, and for the Portuguese, Brazil. I mean, the more problematic way to do it is, some form of self-determination where people decide, which new country they want to live in, and probably slice and dice it into smaller parts. And this, you've probably been following what's been happening in all sorts of countries, but Ethiopia will be the most recent one, where you have ethnic groups in specific areas that really don't want to be part of the larger federal republic or wherever. So, there's really problems with both of these approaches. The two maps here, I think, are fairly instructive. The first on the left, this is colonial Africa. And on the right, post-colonial Africa, modern Africa. what's changed in terms of borders? I mean, I think the answer is not a whole lot. I mean, we have South Sudan that we didn't have before. There are a few other things that have changed there, but basically most African countries have inherited their colonial borders, and most African countries are composed of multiple ethnic groups, multiple languages, several religions, all sorts of other dividing features. So the fact that there have been continuing, shall we say, conflicts in many African countries is, at least to some degree, not completely, but to some degree, I think the result of the way in which the colonial borders were drawn, and the colonial borders were preserved upon independence time, paying no attention to topography, ethnicity, or anything like that. Now, could it have been different? I love this one. This is from a Swedish artist, a guy called Nikolai Sion, and he did a study of political and tribal units, kind of in just before the. I mean, I'm not sure when we can date the scramble for Africa, but in the 1840s it was just beginning. And what he does here is he looked at which ethnic groups were inhabiting which territories, and I don't think you can see a straight line on that map at all. Now, this is something we would call a counterfactual. It didn't happen, but it's kind of interesting to look at, kind of the way in which Africa got sliced and diced by the colonial powers versus how it existed before. And that's not to say that if these borders had been preserved, there wouldn't have been conflict. Sure, everybody was raiding everybody else's territory to steal cattle and stuff like that. But putting together so many ethnic groups into a country, as has happened in colonial times, has been a recipe for trouble. And so anyway, we scratch our heads at Africa, don't we? And these are some of the, perceptions that we have. They're a cartoon on the left from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I've been doing a lot of work on Madagascar recently. Mad as a hatter. Love that one. The map on the right, though, is actually, almost just as interesting here because it shows the most common answer that Google auto-completes when you type in the words, why is such and such a country so? Okay, why is Nigeria so? Why is Egypt so? Why is South Africa so? And we got a lot of poors there, occasional rich, and some hots and some dangerouses there. I mean, it would tend to stereotype countries. Okay, we're going to switch here to the Soviet Union, and I worked in Central Asia starting in 1995. Went there I lived in Kyrgyzstan for a year and a half. I lived in Kazakhstan in 2010 for about 6 months, and I made frequent trips to the region before that. And I'm going to sort of make the argument here that some of the things that happened in Central Asia, or indeed throughout the Soviet Union, were quite similar to what happened in Africa. So just to give a bit of brief history here, in the latter part of the 19th century, the Russia of the Tsars, the Romanovs, pushed to the east into what today we would call Siberia, and down into the southeast into what we would call Central Asia, which is represented here. This is a Soviet map by the Kazakh, Uzbek, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, and Tajik SSRs, short for Soviet Socialist Republics. So when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they kind of inherited the whole Russian Empire, messy, large and messy as it was. And they, the Soviets were very worried about this region, Central Asia, because it was predominantly Islam, and there were lots of ethnic groups there. And so what the Soviets did was they sliced and diced Central Asia to try to create artificial nationalities, and they created these things called Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs. And they also moved a lot of people around. So there were a lot of Russians and Ukrainians that were moved into Central Asia, and Central Asians were moved out. The Soviets were very worried about ethnic discontent, and so by moving people around a lot and making sure that no particular ethnic group was dominant in a certain area, that was one way of social control. So this is how we'll just deal with the Kazakh SSR for a moment. This is Kazakh SSR. Now, for ordinary Soviet citizens for 75 years, the fact that you lived in one Soviet Socialist Republic really didn't make a whole lot of difference. If you lived in the Kazakh SSR and you wanted to go over the border to the Uzbek SSR or the Kyrgyz SSR, to shop or visit your relatives or go to university, it was no big deal at all. I mean, there were some restrictions on travel, but I mean, these were a little bit like, I don't know, state borders, if you like, crossing from West Virginia into Ohio. I mean, there was some border marking, but there were no, customs controls or anything like that. But here's the problem. Suddenly in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves, and you, as a resident of the Kazakh SSR, suddenly find yourself in the newly independent country of Kazakhstan. And you can't cross the border to Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan. There are border posts there. There's a different currency. I mean, there are controls there. So these artificially created states, just like in Africa, became new countries at all. And I mean, as I say, this was all the result of Soviet gerrymandering in the 1920s to create these Soviet Socialist republics for their own purposes of, keeping people down. But suddenly these new countries, the SSRs become the new countries, borders are created. I'm going to talk a little bit about this region. This is a region in the east of Uzbekistan and the south of Kyrgyzstan. And look at that border, the way it goes. The green part is Uzbekistan. It weaves in and out of the hills and here and there and everywhere. I mean, there's a big lump of Tajikistan sticking in there to the valley. Again, as I say, this is a result of the way the Soviets drew the maps between their Soviet Socialist republics. But these borders are then reproduced in, the creation of new countries there. And there's even a couple of enclaves of Uzbekistan right down to the south there. So, I mean, it's a crazy quilt kind of thing there. I'm going to draw your attention to two cities on the east here. One is Osh, which is actually the first place I went to in Kyrgyzstan in 1995, and Jalalabad to the north. Respectively, those are the second and third largest cities in Kyrgyzstan. But as you'll see, in order to drive directly between them, you've got to cross Uzbekistan to do so. Okay, and that's where the problem is, because Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have been not in military conflict, but in conflict for many years. Kyrgyzstan has water behind its dams for hydroelectricity that Uzbekistan needs to have it released so it can irrigate its cotton fields. The Uzbeks have the gas that the Kyrgyz need to heat apartments and factories. So, periodically the gas gets shut off or the water gets shut off, and at the same time there, the border controls go up, and it becomes difficult to cross. So I use this little map here. I've experienced this several times. I think the Uzbeks sort of destroyed a bridge once on the road, at this place Karasu. But what a lot of people have to do here in order to travel, if there's conflict between the countries, is they take the long way around for this little place called Uzgen. You stay in Kyrgyzstan, and it's a longer trip, but it's better than running into the border post. So. Again, the ludicrously, is that right? The ludicrousness, whatever the noun is there, of artificial borders. And so I always like to end anything I do on Central Asia with the New Yorkistan map. This is a classic where poking fun again at our ignorance of these parts of the world, where they took the 5 boroughs and imposed on them all of these. Actually, it's an interesting mix. There are there's some Arabic names, there's some Farsi names, there's also some Yiddish names in there as well. So it's a real mixed up. I love the mullahs. I like Flatbushistan and whatever. Forget about it, Stan. Whatever, And I just used a couple of quotes. I've tried to keep this, shall we say, non-partisan here, with equal criticism of both parties here. So that's John Kerry creating this new country called Kazakhstan, and George Bush going, "Stan who?" about Uzbekistan. But I sort of reflect on this because I would come back to my university and I would try to explain to my colleagues who, most of whom have PhDs and seem to be reasonably well educated, though who would know, explain where I've been. And I said, I've been to Kyrgyzstan. They say, Kurdistan? I said, no, not Kurdistan. No, that's in Iraq and Iran and Syria and Turkey, and it's not actually a country right now, even though it should have become a country in the 1920s. I've been to Kyrgyzstan, and I say between Iran and China, former Soviet Union, and south of Kazakhstan. Eventually, they just said, you've been in Stanland. I can't get my head around these, which kind of gave me the title for my first book, because actually Stanland is total nonsense. The word Stan in Persian means land, so literally I'd been in land. Okay. All right. So we're going to actually sort of wrap up here with maybe the most tragic border story of all, which is the partition of British India in 1947. And I've spent quite a bit of time over the last, decade in India, in Bangladesh. I've been to Pakistan as well, and to Nepal and the Maldives. When I visit a country, then often after I come back, I read more about it. So we're here in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. Britain can no longer afford to hang on to its largest, most populous, richest colony, the jewel in the crown, British India. And the question is, after World War II, Britain's exhausted, there's been a nationalist movement. So the question is, how does India get divided up? And it was not necessarily to be that we would get India and Pakistan out of British India. Look at the map on the right. The pink parts are the princely states. Those are the parts of India which had traditional rulers and some level of independence. The British took care of defense and foreign policy, but internally the rulers, the Maharajas and others had some independence, and the rest of the yellow parts are British India. Now, unfortunately, on the next map the colors are reversed, and so the princely states are in yellow. But I've circled, I got this map. I want to sort of point out just this example of Hyderabad, which I visited several times. Hyderabad in 1947 had a population of about 14 million. It had an economy the size of Belgium's. It was a very thriving state with a Muslim ruler, majority Hindu population. As I say, it was not necessarily so that British India would be divided along religious lines into majority Hindu India and majority Muslim Pakistan. So Hyderabad's a pretty good example. The Nizam of Hyderabad, Asman Ali Khan, whose family had ruled there since the early 17th century, he didn't want to be part of either India or Pakistan. He wanted to continue to be the ruler of the independent country of Hyderabad. And as I say, it had a population of about 14 million. It's a viable country in terms of population. And so he said, and had negotiations, he said, why can't Hyderabad become a constitutional monarchy within the British Commonwealth? God save King George. He may not have said God save King George. I'm making that up, but he kind of made the argument: why do we need to divide, the continent up this way? Can't I be, or can't my place be, and he actually held out for a little bit. Eventually, India moved in and kind of took over the country in 1948, a year later. But the folly of, dividing this huge subcontinent along religious lines, I think, was never anticipated. So here's kind of what happened. There's this guy on the right. His name was Cyril Radcliffe. He was a lawyer in England. Hadn't travelled, never been to India before. And the government said, well, Cyril, we're going to send you to India and we're going to have you draw the boundary between India and Pakistan. And, you got, 3 months to do it. I don't know if that was literally the time, but it was a very short timeline. The British were very keen to get out. And he had, inadequate staff, outdated maps, inaccurate census figures. And the big problem came in 3 large provinces, Punjab in the northwest, and Jammu and Kashmir, also in the northwest, and Bengal in the east, which had roughly the same numbers of Hindus and Muslims. A line had to be drawn somewhere. And when the line was announced in late August 1947, in some places it went through the middle of villages, the middle of houses, and a lot of people found themselves in the wrong place and tried to move. Muslims to Pakistan, Hindus to India. We will never know. How many people died in what I think today would describe as massive ethnic genocide. Could this have been avoided? Could India have been divided in a different way? I really can't say or be sure. It's a matter of historical speculation there. What I know is that in majority Hindu India, today there are more than 200 million Muslims, making it the fourth largest Muslim population in any country in the world. Anyway, Radcliffe went, he did his job, and he came back and burned his notes at home, and I think later realized, he was sent to do a job that, this was a recipe for decades of conflict. So, West and East Pakistan, separated by 1,400 miles of India. What could possibly go wrong? The two parts of Pakistan had very little in common apart from religion. And again, I come back to the fact that using religion as a single criterion for dividing a country is a recipe for disaster. They were different in language, culture, and history. And from the very beginning, there was a simmering resistance movement in Bangladesh, which later broke out into a liberation war in 1971. The West, even though it had slightly less population than the East, took most of the government budget. The East was really underdeveloped, and I've been to Bangladesh 7 or 8 times now, I guess, and still the memory of what happened in 1971 when the Pakistani army was out in the streets murdering people lives long in their memories. But again, the folly of using religion as a principle for creating borders. And look at Bangladesh, the former East Pakistan today. The border snakes in and out and around and around and around. And it's a small country, as I say. It's got a population. It's got the size of Illinois, Iowa, 170 million people there, more or less. So it's a crowded place. Okay, I'm going to end with my cartographic crimes. And if you feel you have a moral obligation to report me to the appropriate authorities in India, I suppose that is your civic right. Okay, so I'm going to quote here. This is the India's 1961 Criminal Law Amendment Act. Criminal law here, publishing a map of India not in conformity with the maps of India as published by the Survey of India. Okay. And also prohibited on the custom declaration. So I will freely confess here that I have broken this law willingly, knowingly, publicly. I have published maps which are in defiance of the Survey of India. What's all the fuss about? The fuss is about Jammu and Kashmir, one of those 3 provinces, Punjab and Bengal, with the other 2 that was artificially divided sort of along religious lines in 1947. And India has never accepted Pakistan's control or rule over part of Kashmir. So India has just over half. There's a bit that China grabbed in a war with India. But if you look on the official India maps, I'll just go back here, you'll see that the whole of the area is part of India. This is the official position. And India will never, never, never change there. And if you show Pakistan's control, oh yeah, okay. They fought 4 wars over this. There's a lot of trouble in Kashmir right now because back in August 2019, actually I was in India when this happened, India revoked sort of the special status that its part of Kashmir had and started governing it from Delhi. They locked up journalists and political and opposition politicians and the internet. Army. So, Kashmir, Indian Kashmir right now is a military zone, pretty much. Again, could this have been different? I don't know, but this is one of the tensest borders in the world. All of which creates problems for our friend Google. Okay, Google, of course, likes to do business everywhere. Okay, and will tend to bow to, shall we say, local political sensibilities. So if you're in India, looking at the area of Kashmir, you will see the map on the right, which conforms to the India, the survey of India map showing the whole of the region being part of India. But cross the border into Pakistan, if you can, and you'll see this Google map, which is a more accurate representation of what actually goes on there. So again, whose map do you believe? Which borders do you believe? It depends on where you are. So I'm going to stop here, and I would love to hear questions or comments or about your own border experiences. I was sending out travel notes or sort of travel essays for a while. I have to stop that really with COVID because I wasn't traveling anywhere else. But if you want to get onto my kind of mailing list, I'm not going to kill you with mailings. You'll get maybe a notice of a presentation. I've got other presentations that I do and things like that. So you can just email me at davidhmould@gmail.com, put that H in the middle or it'll get returned. So I'm going to stop share here, and we'll ask Sandy to open the mics or see if we've got anything in the, okay, I don't think there's anything in the chat box there. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Are there questions or comments or sharings of the borders that people would like to share? I think you can just open up your mic and or any other questions for David as well.
Oh, come on, people, speak up. Oh, there's Harvey. Okay, I knew he'd have something to say.
I think that's wonderful. Thanks. It was great, especially starting with the idea of perception. Of course, that's the whole, that frames your whole argument here in terms of, and that's really very, very true as to, and the breakup of the United States is very current, with people talking about making 3 states out of California and et cetera, et cetera. There's been a number of these kinds of things, all having to do with this question of the electoral college, of course, in terms of the number of senators and all of these kinds of things. So that's the history of that, and now the future of that, of course, is very, very real. One other aspect that you might continue with, I'm sure you have done, are the various corridors that have been created. The one in Angola not Angola, Southwest Africa,
Namibia?
In Namibia, yeah, right. That goes up in, and it's a very, very narrow corridor that, and the question is why, and all of that history, it's kind of fascinating. And among other, certainly in South Asia too, as well. But so thank you. No, this was really great, and the little stories that many of us have about Osh and Allahabad and the Bishkek and so forth, and trying to get from Osh to Bishkek is quite a problem.
Yeah. I mean, the point about corridors is, I think, a pretty good one there, and there are kind of a number of examples there. The big one in India is called the Siliguri corridor, which connects northeast India to what people call mainland India. And that's a kind of interesting concept, by the way. But again, that's a function of partition. I mean, East Pakistan was created, and you would have had this whole kind of what's now 7 states of northeast India completely cut off. So they have to sort of I mean, the corridor, I think, is at its narrowest point only 17 kilometers wide. I mean, and that then is, very, very dangerous. I mean, the Chinese are just over the border. They come in and close it down very easily. So yeah, those little connecting parts. So, I mean, I kind of urge everybody to, open a map and look at it, and look at the weird things on the map, because there's usually a good story as to how that came to be, Yeah.
So this is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Fascinating talk. Thank you. So I live in Aurora, and I spend sometimes summers several days up in the Thousand Islands, which is in the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's the international border, of course, between New York and Ontario to the north. And there are actually more than 1,000 islands. There's well over 1,700 islands, and two-thirds of them are Canadian. But the international border threads its way through these more than 1,700 islands down through the Seaway and the St. Lawrence River. And in particular, one international boundary marker has always fascinated me. It's on Mary Island, which is a state park, New York State Park, entirely dedicated to camping. And to get there to camp, you must have a boat, of course. And I kayak there, and I've camped there many times. And it's about probably less than 1 square mile, but there's an international marker in concrete, about 4 feet high, about 18 inches circular. It's a fairly substantial marker for the international border, and it sits right on a cliff on the very north end of the island. So there's a little piece of Canada on Mary Island, probably measured in square feet.
Wow.
Relative to the rest of the island. And of course, Canada lays no claim to it, but there it sits.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, I love these kind of stories. I mean, and I pointed out on one of the slides there a couple of enclaves of Uzbekistan in Kyrgyzstan. And anytime you have these little bits of one country surrounded by other countries, it's like, how did that come to be? Actually, there's a good story in Bangladesh and India, because until I think 2015 there were something like 200, I mean more than that, I mean several hundred Indian enclaves in Bangladesh and several hundred enclaves of Bangladesh within India, sort of completely surrounded by the other country's territory. And in one case there was something called a counter enclave. Harvey should love this one. So it's a little piece of Bangladesh surrounded by India, surrounded by Bangladesh in India. It's like this is, I mean, it's just craziness, absolutely. But I mean, as distinct from your little bit of cliff on the island there, the people who live in these places are actually cut off from their own country. They have to cross a border, or sometimes 2 borders, in order to get to their country. So, but yeah, but I like your example, and I have to look at a map in some detail there. But I bet probably also within some of those other islands there are other little interesting geographical anomalies there. Yeah.
I'll send you a photo of the monument.
That would be super. Do you think the US is going to invade and take over that little bit of Canada? We'll have an international border incident. Yeah, but no, I think it's fascinating. And of course, there you can cross into Canada with no border controls at all, right?
Is not the U.S. border and Canada border one of the longest, if not the longest?
Yeah, I'm not going to say something I can't be sure of. Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, I believe it's a. Harvey, do you know, is that the longest border in the world? I'm turning to my geography expert here. We'll have to check it, won't we? Okay. I've learned as I got older not to guess and not to claim something when I'm not absolutely sure of it. So thank you. Yeah. But and I think there's some stuff also out in the west as well. Washington State, where there are sort of little bits of Canada that are sort of detached from the United States. So, fascinating. Great. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great example. And if you'd send me the picture, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Remember the 54-40-year fight, which is the latitude that you would go to create the British Canada at that point, and the United States, and with respect to Oregon and Washington and
Right.
and
Yeah.
British Columbia. Yes.
Yeah.
So, speaking of Oregon and Washington, I grew up in Oregon, and it seemed to me, growing up out there in the 50s and 60s, that the map that you showed, the New York map that you showed, to me, the map was the reverse of that.
Yes.
And I always felt that, as a teenager, and I suppose when I started college around that time, I felt like, gosh, it's great to live in a place where New York City and Washington, D.C. are so blessedly far away. And they really don't have a whole lot of effect on us out here.
Yeah,
course,
I mean, yeah.
Incorrect perception, but perception is something. Really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. Sandy, are we going to wrap here, or you want to see if there are any more questions?
I might say hi to Harvey. I think Harvey and I were together in the Peace Corps in 1962. Bill will notice here.
Were you in the Peace Corps, Harvey?
Harvey, unmute your mic. Yeah.
In the Peace Corps.
Yeah, when I was in the Peace Corps, I was in Nigeria. Yeah, and in fact, I was on the border of Cameroon and Nigeria.
You and I were in the same group, Harvey.
I'm going back and forth. Huh? Yeah.
He was in your group.
Huh?
He was in your group.
You were Group
Yes.
6.
Yes.
Fantastic.
I have some experience. I also had some experience crossing borders because with 2 other volunteers, we made a trip overland to Timbuktu. And in Mali, they took our passports and we had to just stay till they're ready to give them back.
Well, I had a similar kind of problem going off to Chad, across the Cameroon border and then into Chad, and coming back, and the border was closed. So we tried to outrun, and we actually were stopped, and we had a little problem there at the customs border where we were stuck, and eventually had to get a friend to come and bail us out, as it were. So, and the eventual reason for that, and the eventual end of that was that my Jeep was taken away by the Peace Corps. So there was an interesting international question. The embassy in Chad was so excited to have this group of a few Americans come, and we were so excited to be there. It was the first I ever seen. So when they sent to the Peace Corps in Lagos, and said, "Oh, that was wonderful. Send some more." Wait a minute. It's a long story, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sure those were crazy times to be traveling in West Africa. Absolutely. I mean, it's, travel today has become a little bit more predictable, but there, anytime you reach a border, it's like, well, what's going to happen next?
What a small world to have Dylan Harvey in the same virtual lecture here. Yeah, amazing.
I haven't seen Harvey since 1962.
He looks the same, Dill?
He's added a little weight.
Where are you right now, Harvey?
How?
Where are you?
Where am I? We're in Poughkeepsie.
Hey.
Yeah, not too far from you folks, right? But I've been on the postcard stuff with David, and so that's how we heard of this, event, which is wonderful. Glad to see David in New York State. And,
virtually. Yes.
Any other questions for David, or other border stories, or I know he has other talks he could share with us too, maybe with some travels with photos and other things that he does when he does visit the countries. So might be nice to have you back.
I'd be really happy to do that, and I really thank everybody for interesting questions. And boy, Harvey and Dilwyn, glad to be able to connect you. It's like you're gonna have to put that down in your library annual report, Sandy.
I think I shall. Yeah, that's pretty neat.
Oh, dear. Oh God, that's great. That's great.